This video will cover the second part of the structure and function of blood vessels section of Unit 2 in the cardiovascular system, and it covers the exchange of materials. So your knowledge of this will need to be based on the knowledge of blood vessels. So if you haven't watched the first video about arteries and capillaries and veins, I suggest that you go and do that first. What I'm going to do is introduce a capillary first and then go further into a capillary network. Okay, so right now, this would be showing a capillary. Now you can tell this is a capillary because it has a single layer of endothelial cells. Okay, and also you can see that it is only wide enough to fit through one red blood cell, which is shown here. Now again, you'll still need to know about the fact that transports or carries oxygen. And bear in mind that is carried by the hemoglobin within the red blood cell. Now this one here will show a white blood cell. Now in Unit 3 we're going to talk about that in more detail, but for right now we can just label it generally as a white blood cell. Okay. Now the liquid part of the blood here is called the plasma. In an essay question, remember to state just generally what that is. So it's the liquid part of the blood. Now that liquid part of the blood will transport a range of substances. So it'll have things like water, CO2, salt, glucose, amino acids, it'll have hormones and a whole range of other things. Now outside of this capillary, there are cells that are then supplied with the materials that come from the blood. So this would be cells in a tissue, for example, in the muscle. And the substances would then move from that capillary out and into those tissues. Now, because all these substances are dissolved in some kind of fluid, whether it's water or whatever else, then it needs to also dissolve into the fluid that will surround the cells. So around about the cells, there is tissue fluid. Okay, so just to describe what that is, it surrounds the cells in a tissue. Sometimes, in a very fancy way, it's described as the fluid the cells are bathed in. So what I'm going to show you now is a slightly zoomed out view of this, okay, in a capillary network. So this here is a diagram of a capillary network, sometimes called a capillary bed. Okay, so in terms of labeling things, this would be the first thing that you'd really want to do. So if we have blood flow coming from the heart, away from the heart, and then into this network of capillaries, first of all, this would be a capillary. And therefore the blood that would feed into this is coming from an artery. So that would be a branch of an artery that would then feed into a capillary. And this then, therefore, the blood that's feeding out of that would therefore be a vein. There's a few other things I'd like to label at this point in time, which I'll come back to. This will be a lymph vessel. Okay, these are cells in a tissue, just body cells. And then therefore, this fluid around about those cells is the tissue fluid I was talking about. So remember that tissue fluid contains a range of substances, salts, sugars, all that kind of stuff, water and things like that. Now in that capillary bed, right, this whole capillary bed, that capillary contains blood, okay, which contains plasma. Okay, as well. And that plasma has all those dissolved substances in it. Now what I've got in the next bit is a description of all these and how the stages of this works. So I'm going to work my way through them step by step and show you the process of this. So initially when blood comes in from this artery, it is at high pressure. Okay, and while the capillaries will be slightly lower in pressure than that, the blood in the capillaries is still at much higher pressure than the tissue fluid that's here. And because of that, what happens is fluids move out of that blood and then into the tissue fluid. Okay, now that process, because of the forcing of that stuff out of that blood, is called pressure filtration. Okay, because substances have been forced out of that blood capillary and into that surrounding tissue fluid. Okay, so therefore that process is called pressure filtration. Now, in that plasma, there are substances called plasma proteins. Plasma proteins are really, really large. They won't fit across that blood vessel and across through the wall of that capillary. So in this, plasma proteins don't pass through the walls of the capillary as they're too large. So everything else, water, oxygen, sugar, stuff like that, will pass from that blood into that tissue fluid, but plasma proteins won't. Okay, so just to give you a bit of a key here, the pink arrows would be things like oxygen, water, salts, glucose, etc., etc. Okay, but it will not be plasma proteins. It's kind of in the name. They're called plasma proteins for a reason. They're only found in plasma. Now, if you think about your cells require oxygen, they require water, they require salts, all these kind of things that these things move in. So it's dissolved into the tissue fluid, it's forced from that plasma into the tissue fluid. And then for that substance to get into the cells, it then diffuses into those cells. So that's the initial 5 point about things moving into cells be caused by diffusion, because they're in a higher concentration here and a lower concentration there. So the substances would move from that tissue fluid then into the cells. And that's what I'm going to show you here. Okay, so that substance then diffuses into the body cells. Now, on the opposite side of things, if you think about respiration, respiration will require glucose and oxygen, which will get pulled into the cell by diffusion, but it will also produce some substances that the cells want to then get rid of. So the cells would get rid of things like carbon dioxide and other wastes, and they would diffuse out of the cells and into the tissue fluid. Okay, and that's what happens here. Now, once that happens and it's in the tissue fluid, those substances, like carbon dioxide, will then move from that tissue fluid then into the blood, because that tissue fluid still got a higher concentration than the blood has, so it'll move in from there. Okay, so again, as a key, those blue ones would be CO2 and waste as well. Now, the pressure at this end is obviously not as high as up here, and it gets lower and lower and lower as it goes. So pressure will decrease to this side where there's low pressure. Now, because that pressure is low, it allows these substances that were in the tissue fluid to then move back in and to flow back in themselves. Okay, so the pressure is lowest at that vein end, and therefore substances just start to move in to that blood, just because they're moving from an area of high pressure to low pressure. So that tissue fluid will start to return into the blood, and that blood will then flow from the capillary into the vein. Now with this then, because these cells are surrounded by tissue fluid, most of it will then go back into the circulatory system, just straight into the capillaries. However, you might sometimes have too much tissue fluid, right, excess tissue fluid, and particularly if you have really high blood pressure, it can force more fluid out of your blood. So if you've got excess tissue fluid, what will happen is it will get absorbed in this lymph vessel here. That lymph vessel contains lymph. Okay, and that lymph absorbs excess tissue fluid. Now when you see a lymph vessel, it will normally look like it's kind of behind the whole capillary network, feeding in and kind of be tendrils like I've got drawn. Okay, so the capillary will be very separate from that lymph vessel. Now, once all the excess tissue fluid has been absorbed by the lymph vessel, eventually it needs to go back to the blood, which is exactly what happens. It's returned to the circulatory system. So I'm going to leave this just as the final kind of still of this video. I'm going to move that diagram slightly so you can take a screenshot if you want from there. And then I'm going to move this in slightly so you can take a screenshot of the instructions or the stages of that if you want it. Okay, and this is done with the structure and functions of blood vessels and that exchange of substances.